Welcome to the Minister's Cat Echism, question 32. Some questions are so big that the teacher has to listen to the answers from different children and then put the answers together to get a complete answer. Question 32 is a big question. It's so big we need to collect together several answers so that we can get a complete answer. With question 32 we shall look at part 1 of the answer, and with question 33 we'll look at part 2 of the answer, and then with question 34 we'll look at part 3 of the answer. So, what is this big question? This big question is, what is sin? Here are different shapes: a sphere, a cube, a cylinder, a cone, and a rectangular block. Only one of these shapes is small enough and the right shape to fit through the hole. Yes, you got it? The rectangular block. The others do not fit. God has set the shape that He wants our lives to be, the kind of lives He wants us to live. Our lives ought to fit the shape that God has set for us, but they don't because of sin. Question 32 is, what is sin? And part 1 of the answer is, sin is not being like Jesus in all we think and say and do. Sin is not being like Jesus in all we think and say and do. When people saw and heard Jesus, they saw and heard a human being who had no sin. No one ever heard from his mouth words of boasting, words of cruelty aimed to hurt others. They only ever heard kind words, truthful words. No empty words, no swearing, no lying, no words of foolish nonsense, but always words that were wise. No words muttered under his breath, but always clear words he was never ashamed to repeat. He was always worth listening to. Whatever he did with his hands, it was always the right thing to do. In all the games he played as a boy, with all the tools he used as a carpenter, sawing and planing and hammering and painting, all was done with joy and care and no sin. When he left carpentry, he used his hands for kindness, stretching out his hand to touch the leper, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, rescuing sinking Peter. And even when making a whip to overturn the money changer's table in the temple, he never used his hands for anything sinful. John wrote about him, "We have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth." John chapter 1 verse 14. God wants our lives to be just like His Son Jesus. We are to be copies of Jesus' life in thought and word and deed, lives without sin. Sometimes when people copy a picture or a scene from nature, they put a grid in front of it. They also have a grid where they're going to draw their copy. They look very carefully at what they're going to copy, and they try to do exactly the same on their grid. If you were to draw this butterfly, you might start with its body, and then its head, and add the antennae, and having done that you may move on to the wings, and then start filling in the details. It's not easy. You have to keep looking at the original. Sometimes people don't bother to make an exact copy, they just draw their own version of the butterfly. They may like their copy, but it's not a good copy of the original. Sin is not being like Jesus in all we think and say and do. The more we look at Jesus' life, the more we see the beauty and the glory of a human being who never sinned. We also learn that Romans 3:23 is true about us. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We fall way short of being like Jesus. We should not shape our lives on the pattern set by the people around us. We should shape our lives on the pattern that God has given to us, the pattern of his Son, Jesus. We should not compare ourselves with others who may be very naughty and very bad and think, well, I'm not that bad, I'm not a sinner. We must look at Jesus and compare our lives with his. We will certainly see then that we are sinners. Sin is not being like Jesus in all we think and say and do. Here's a verse that reminds us that we should shape our lives following the example of Jesus, the example of life without sin. An example. Follow in his steps. He committed no sin. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. Thank you for joining us for question 32. Join us again.